Fidelity's got a second number, one that comes for you a decade after the first one. By 40, you should have 3 times your salary saved for retirement. Make 90,000, you should have 270,000 sitting there. I've watched this one land at a dinner table exactly once. And the woman across from me put her fork down mid-bite. Not dramatically, just quietly set it down like the pasta had personally betrayed her. Because at 40, this number doesn't feel like a distant hypothetical anymore. It feels like a countdown. So, today, the real numbers, what people your age actually have according to the Federal Reserve, not according to whatever finance account decided to make you feel small this week, where you should actually be standing if you rent instead of own. And then the math on catching up, the specific monthly number, because 40 is the last age where that math is still gentle. What nobody tells you when they quote that 3 times figure is what it's actually assuming about the last 15 years of your life. And once you see the assumption, the number stops being scary and starts being useful. Let's get into it. Here's the full ladder, since the number means nothing without it. Fidelity says 1 times your salary by 30, 3 times by 40, 6 times by 50, 8 times by 60, 10 times your final salary by 67. It's built off market simulations aiming for a 90% chance you're fine in retirement, even if the market has a rough decade somewhere in there. The assumption baked into every rung of that ladder is that you've been saving 15% of your pre-tax income every single year since age 25, employer match included, not 15% starting this afternoon in a panic. 15% for 15 straight years already, through every job change, every rent increase. Every year, you were also supposedly saving for a wedding and a down payment at the same time. So, the 3 times by 40 stat isn't really a snapshot of where you are. It's a snapshot of where you'd be if a specific disciplined plan had already been running quietly in the background for a decade and a half, probably before you had any income stable enough to sustain it. And this is exactly the number that gets sliced out of its own instruction manual and turned into a panic reel. The comment section always goes the same way too. Someone posts their actual balance, and 40 replies show up explaining why they're personally doomed, right above an ad for a course that fixes the doom for $200. Keep the number, it's a genuinely useful compass. Just stop grading yourself against it like it's a report card. Because a guideline built by an investment company to help you plan is not the same thing as a verdict on your worth as an adult. One clarifying note before we move on: Fidelity means gross salary before tax. If you've been running this math against your take-home pay, you've been holding yourself to a stricter version of the guideline than the one that actually exists. Make $90,000 before tax. Your target at 40 is $270,000 combined across every retirement account you have. Old 401k from a job you left in 2019. Current one, any IRA sitting on the side, all of it added together. There's a second assumption buried in there too, and it matters more the older you get. The 15% since 25 math assumes continuous full-time employment, no unpaid leave, no years spent freelancing while the industry figured itself out, no stretch where you left a job to care for someone. Fidelity's model doesn't have a line item for any of that. Your actual life did. Here's the real data. Among 35 to 44-year-olds who actually have a retirement account, the Federal Reserve's most recent survey of consumer finances puts the median balance at $45,000. And that number dropped. In the previous survey, it was $69,550. Not because this generation suddenly got worse at saving, but because a chunk of that money got pulled out to survive a few genuinely brutal years in between. And that $45,000 only describes people who have an account in the first place. Only 61.5% of households in this age range do. If If you're sitting at 0 right now, you are not an outlier having some kind of personal crisis. You are closer to 40% of the room than the finance content in your feed would ever admit. Liquid cash, the money actually sitting in checking and savings, comes in at a median of $7,500 for this age group. The average gets quoted much higher, over $40,000, for the same reason it always does. A handful of very wealthy households drag the average up while doing absolutely nothing for the typical family's actual balance. Zoom out to total net worth, and the median for this age group sits around $135,000. The average, pulled up by the same handful of households, sits closer to $550,000. That gap is the difference between the typical household your age and the typical household your age plus a few people who founded something in 2019 and never looked back. Now let's talk about the roof, because at this age it starts mattering more than it used to. Homeownership among 35 to 44-year-olds currently sits at 60.9%, which means almost 4 in 10 people your age are still renting, and that's not a smaller, sadder category than owning. It's just where a real chunk of your peer group is standing. Here's the part that actually surprises people. The median monthly mortgage payment right now is about $1,600. The median asking rent on a vacant unit is about $1,494. Those two numbers are practically sitting next to each other. The rent isn't secretly cheap, and the mortgage isn't secretly punishing. The real difference isn't the monthly number at all. The real difference is where that money goes afterward. A chunk of a mortgage payment builds equity, an asset that's yours whether the market goes up or sideways. All of a rent payment goes to someone else's asset. That's a real structural difference, and it's worth naming honestly. But renting at 40 isn't a financial failure either, and I want to be careful here, because a lot of finance content quietly implies otherwise. If you rent, every dollar you're not putting toward a down payment or upkeep or property tax is a dollar that's fully available for a brokerage account instead, growing with 0 maintenance calls at 11 at night. Different math, same finish line, as long as the difference is actually going somewhere instead of just evaporating into a nicer apartment than you needed. And to be fair to the renters in the room, that $1,600 median mortgage payment is rarely the whole story either. It doesn't include the property tax bill, the homeowner's insurance renewal that somehow always goes up, or the water heater that picks the worst possible month to die. Owning builds equity. It also occasionally hands you a 4-figure surprise with 0 notice. Both of those things are true at once. For what it's worth, at 34, I let a financial advisor, a family friend, vouched for talk me into a whole life insurance policy dressed up as a retirement account. Took me almost 3 years to notice the fees were quietly eating half my return every single year because nobody had told me to ask what he was getting paid to recommend it to me. So if your version of behind involves a financial professional who was, in retrospect, mostly selling himself a commission, you are in good company over here. Here's the part that matters more than any single benchmark. At 40, you've still got roughly 25 years before a typical retirement age. That's not a small runway. It's most of your working life, still ahead of you, still compounding. The panic version of this math treats 40 like the finish line is close. It isn't. What's actually true is that you're at the halfway point of a marathon, not the last mile of a sprint. And the pace you set from here matters more than whatever pace you ran in your 20s. I also want to name something specific to this decade, because it's rarely the discipline problem people assume it is. Your late 30s and 40s are frequently when you're financially squeezed from 2 directions at once, kids on one side, aging parents on the other. Researchers actually have a name for it, the sandwich generation. And it disproportionately lands on women, who are still more likely to be the one who cuts hours or takes the unpaid leave when a parent needs care. That's not a "you didn't try hard enough" story. That's two entirely legitimate financial obligations arriving in the same 10-year window, on top of a mortgage or a rent increase, on top of whatever your own retirement account was supposed to be doing this whole time. Nobody warns you that your peak earning years and your peak expense years frequently show up on the same calendar. AARP put actual numbers on this in their most recent caregiving survey. The average caregiver spends around $7,200 a year out of pocket, and nearly half report a major financial hit from it, taking on debt, pausing their own savings, sometimes going without something as basic as groceries. Under 50 specifically, closer to half of caregivers are doing it for a parent and a child in the same stretch of years. That's not a rounding error in your budget. That's a second mortgage payment's worth of money. Some years, going somewhere Fidelity's spreadsheet never accounts for. So here's the actual reframe, and it's the same one that matters at every age on this ladder. You don't need to retroactively hit the 40-year-old number. You need to hit the next one. Fidelity gives you until 50 to reach 6 times your salary, and closing that gap from wherever you're actually standing is a completely different, far more achievable project than trying to manufacture a decade and a half of missed saving out of thin air. 10 years is a real amount of runway to build 6 times your salary from wherever you currently sit, even if that number is uncomfortably close to zero today. Compounding does most of the heavy lifting. Your job is mostly to stop interrupting it. Here's why this decade specifically deserves your attention instead of your dread. Turn 50, and the IRS hands you extra room to contribute. An official catch-up provision built for exactly this situation. It sounds like a safety net. What almost nobody explains is what that safety net actually costs you if you wait for it instead of starting now. That's the part we're building next, because it's the actual argument for moving this month instead of after your next birthday. Here's the math nobody runs for you. Say you want an extra $500,000 sitting in an account by 65, on top of whatever else you've already got growing. Start putting money toward that today at 40, using something close to the market's long-run historical average return, and you need about $617 a month. Wait until 50 to start the exact same goal, and that same $500,000 target now costs you about $1,577 a month. That's not a small gap. Waiting the extra decade doesn't just cost you 10 years of deposits. It costs you 10 years of the account compounding on top of itself, which is the part that quietly does most of the work. The monthly number required to hit the same finish line more than doubles. That's the actual argument for starting this decade instead of the next one. Not guilt, math. And here's the part that catches people off guard. At 50, the IRS does hand you extra room, an additional $8,000 a year in a 401k on top of the regular limit, an extra $1,100 in an IRA. Hit 60, and that 401k catch-up jumps again to over $11,000 a year. A window the IRS specifically widened for people trying to close exactly this kind of gap late. It's real, and it's worth using once you get there. But it's built for people who genuinely couldn't start earlier, not as a reason to delay if you can start now. Extra contribution room at 50 doesn't refund you the 15 years of growth that money would have had if it had gone in at 40 instead. That ship, once it sails, doesn't circle back for a pickup. So here's how you actually close the gap to 6 times your salary by 50 without blowing up your budget this month. You ramp in 3 stages across the decade instead of jumping straight to 15%. 8%, then 12, then 16. Each stage running a few years before the next one kicks in. One note before the numbers. If your employer offers a 401k match, claim the full match starting this month, regardless of what stage you're technically in. That's not part of the ramp. That's compensation you already earned and are currently leaving on the table. Years 1 through 3 run at 8% of your gross pay, automated the day you get paid. On $50,000 a year, that's $333 a month. On $75,000, $500. On $100,000, $667. Small enough to barely notice, which is exactly the point of starting here instead of at the number that made you close this tab out of fear. Years 4 through 7 step up to 12%. On $50,000, that's $417 a month. On $75,000, $750. On $100,000, $1,000. By now, the 8% habit is already boring, which is precisely what you want a savings habit to become. Years 8 through 10 land at 16%, slightly past Fidelity's baseline 15, which is what actually closes a real gap instead of just keeping pace. On $50,000, $667 a month. On $75,000, $1,000. On $100,000, $1,333. Run the full 10 years, and here's what you've actually put in, not counting a single dollar of employer match or market growth. On $50,000 a year, $60,000 contributed. On $75,000, $90,000. On $100,000, $120,000. Add in the match and whatever the market did across a full decade, and the real balance lands meaningfully higher than that for almost everyone who stays on the ramp. Quick note on where it goes. Match first into the 401k always. After that, a Roth IRA if you qualify for one, since you're contributing money you've already paid tax on, and it grows completely untouched from here forward. One honest exception. If you're carrying credit card debt above roughly 20% interest, that debt compounds faster than almost any investment account reliably beats, so it wins the math first. Keep a small automatic amount moving into savings underneath it anyway. Then redirect the whole ramp once the balance is gone. And if a raise comes through anywhere along this 10-year stretch, bump the percentage before your spending has a chance to notice the extra money existed. Most plans will auto-increase your contribution by a point or two every year if you turn that setting on once and never think about it again. You don't need a financial advisor selling you a product dressed up as a plan to run this. You need one automatic transfer, adjusted 3 times over a decade, doing the discipline for you while you're busy living the actual rest of your life. So, back to that number from the top. 3 times your salary by 40 was never a report card. And it was never built to account for a mortgage that costs about the same as your rent, a parent who needed help this year, or a kid whose soccer season somehow costs more than your car payment. You now have the real numbers, the median, not the headline, and the actual reason the gap exists. More importantly, you've got a 10-year plan that starts small, ramps on a schedule, and lands you at Fidelity's actual next checkpoint instead of the one that already passed. You know your monthly number for each phase, you know where the money goes, and you know exactly what waiting until 50 actually costs you in real dollars. Your one action item out of this entire video: set up the automatic transfer for the first phase this week, 8% on payday, before you see the money sitting there. Everything else on this ramp runs on autopilot from here. If you found this useful, subscribe, because the same finance bro who turned that first number into a panic reel has a second version of the pitch waiting for you at 40, and it usually shows up wearing a suit and calling itself a free consultation. I learned that one the expensive way so you don't have to. I'll keep putting the context back into these numbers, one overhyped statistic and one commission-hungry advisor at a time, so you're deciding off real data instead of whatever's designed to make you panic click. I'll see you in the next one.